Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support, please subscribe. The brutal executions of Bloody Mary. The Marian Persecutions. Mary I has a reputation for being a brutal queen, hence her nickname, Bloody Mary. Her reputation as a bloodthirsty ruler is what led to her name, but the actual events in question were known as the Marian Persecutions and were fuelled by religion, with the sole purpose of ridding the kingdom of Protestants. An important aspect to remember is that throughout time, persecutions have been either politically fuelled or to help solidify the monarchy. The Marian persecutions were different, the exception to the rule, if you like. They persecuted Protestants with the aim to return the country to the religion of the Queen's Catholicism. In a span of 5 years, approximately 280 souls were executed, and the majority were burnt at the stake. Mary tried with all her might to reverse the reformation set in place by her predecessors and return her country to what she believed to be the true faith. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and unless you count Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, Mary was England's first ever queen in her own right. The Reformation was set in motion by her father, as the Pope had refused to allow him to divorce Mary's mother. Mary had initially stated that her country did not have to conform to the faith of the crown, but this did not last long. First, the country saw priests and bishops being imprisoned, and Mary restored legislation that dictated the governing of churches. And then, in the January of 1555, the country was officially returned to a Catholic state. However, not all the country conformed, and many remained true to their own faith. A sad but intriguing thought is that many of the punishments Mary distributed were actually inspired by her husband, Philip II of Spain. The persecutions did not exist until after Mary had married Philip, so it's widely considered that perhaps it's the Spanish influence on the crown that inspired the persecutions to begin with. It was common, during the reign of Mary I, for Protestants to find safety in other parts of the world. Many fled to Europe because many sects or factions within the English society believed that to be Protestant was to be a heretic, and heretics needed to be punished. But heresy was not a new concept. The word itself comes from hereseis, a Latin translation of the Greek word, originally meaning choosing, choice, or course of action, or even a sect or school of thought. The word first appears in the New Testament, and by the 1st century denoted warring factions and the party spirit. The word heresy, by the time of Mary I, has been around for around 500 years, with its appropriation by the Church to mean a sect or division that threatened the unity of Christians. In simple terms, heresy is a belief or opinion that goes against orthodox religious doctrine. So during the reign of Mary I, to be a heretic was to be a Protestant and go against Catholicism. Heretics were mostly burnt at the stake in order to ensure their bodies were left as nothing but dust. Relics would be often taken from those deemed as holy or divine, and individuals would take body remains or belongings. So instead of death by beheading or hanging, a heretic would be burnt, and Mary I felt that this was the punishment heretics, during her reign, deserved. By burning individuals at the stake, Mary was making a huge statement to the public. These persecutions, under her reign, became known as the Marian Persecutions, and they were nothing short of brutal and barbaric. Whenever an execution took place, eyewitnesses would report the air as being thick with the smell of burning flesh, and that people could not go outside. Now, before we look at some examples of these horrific executions, we're going to briefly look at the events of November 17th, 1558. Mary I had just died, and because all sentences needed to be signed by the monarch by law, the executions were stopped. The execution was ready to take place, but a messenger came running in shouting, "The Queen is dead," and because she had passed, the execution therefore, by law, was cancelled. The poor souls who were due to be executed had their lives spared. Now the first to suffer in the Marian persecutions was a man called John Rogers. He had become a clergyman in London and was in Antwerp with a William Tyndale. John rescued William's biblical translations after he was arrested, and John stayed on the continent until 1548 and then returned to London a marked man. He was arrested and burnt at the stake in Smithfield on the 4th of February 1555. Immediately after his death, he was made a proto-martyr of thus and time. John Rogers went ahead of all those who expected to die at the hands of the Marian persecutions. Another individual who was executed was John Cardmaker. He was a Devon man, and he started his career as a friar and became warden of Franciscan Convent in Exeter. John embraced reform in 1534 and married a widow after leaving the order. John then became the vicar of St. Bride's in London, and he was then arrested in 1554. He briefly complied, but he could not turn his back on his faith, and after conversations with fellow prisoners, he turned back to his Protestant opinions. John Cardmaker was then burnt at the stake at Smithfield on the 30th of May 1555, and then on the 27th of June 1556, a group of 13 people, later known as the Stratford Martyrs, were executed. They were made up of 11 men and 2 women, and they all refused to renounce their Protestant beliefs. Those martyrs didn't all come from the East End of London. In fact, they were a disparate group from multiple different locations. And to make an already horrific ordeal worse, one of the poor individuals condemned was pregnant. The 13 souls were held in Newgate prison for a trial by religious tribunal in the June of 1556. It is believed that during the trial all agreed to their heresy and refused to conform and deny it. So they were consequently condemned to death by fire. A sad truth is that at the time most executions were open to the public and used by many as a form of entertainment. Mary I used this to her advantage. She wanted the executions to be a lesson. The Stratford Martyrs were executed in front of a crowd of up to 20,000 people, and for the time that was a big deal. The morning of the executions, the martyrs were brought from their cells at Newgate by cart in the early hours. All were offered a chance to recant and be spared, but none took the opportunity. Eyewitnesses stated the 11 men were split between 3 stakes, each tied to them, but the 2 women were left standing in the middle of the pyre. All 13 were then burnt alive at the same time. This account in itself sums up the horror and brutality of the Marian persecutions. 13 individuals burnt for heresy all at the same time. A truly horrific and heartless deed. Now, the Lewes Martyrs were a group of 17 Protestants burnt at the stake in Lewes, East Sussex. The individuals died between 1555 and 1557 by being burnt at the stake. The largest mass execution of the Lewes Martyrs was on the 22nd of June 1557. 10 individuals were killed by fire at the order of Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London. Now this execution was the largest single bonfire of people that had ever taken place in England. The 10 poor souls had not been kept in the jail beforehand, but rather in the undercroft of the Star Inn. Also, in the July of 1555, a group of people, later known as the Canterbury Martyrs, were executed by being burnt at the stake. First, 4 men were executed, and then just 1 month later, a further 6 individuals were killed, This trend continued, and around 41 individuals, give or take, were burnt at the stake over a period of 3 years. These individuals became known as the Canterbury Martyrs. Executions took place in Wisbech as well. 2 men were executed for not believing that the sacramental bread and wine was in fact the body and blood of Christ. The persecutions even reached as far as the Channel Islands, and even in Guernsey, executions by fire took place. Now, the Guernsey Martyrs is a subject we plan to cover in another video, but these were 3 women burnt at the stake for their Protestant beliefs. But a horrifying detail is that one of these women was believed to be heavily pregnant at the time, and whilst she was being killed by fire, her baby, upon the bursting of her belly, fell into the fire. The Marian persecutions affected all manner of person, regardless of class or status. Fox's Book of Martyrs tells us about the brutality of Mary's reign and goes into details about the souls who suffered at the hands of the Marian persecutions, among others. But, as the book is in a sense biased, one must read it with scepticism. But the images included in his book show the brutality, cruelty and inhumanity that the Marian persecutions were. But Mary wasn't the only evil during this time. As previously mentioned, the Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, was also known as Blood Bonner. He had a hand to play, as 1/3 of all those burnt at the stake were under his orders or sentencing. A horrifying example of Bonner's character was the horrific treatment of Thomas Tomkins. During one of the interrogations of Thomas, Edmund forced his hand over a candle flame until his skin blistered and burned. Edmund Bonner was also known to punish heretics by whipping and beating them. He was also described as a cannibal because he would feed on the blood of his victims and spare no one. So Mary earned her nickname because of the Marian persecutions, but she was not as brutal as her father, yet only she was given the moniker of Bloody Mary. Maybe Mary was seen as a more barbaric leader because people saw their community devastated by their friends or family being burnt to death, a large number, for a shorter reign than her predecessor, her father, Henry VIII. Mary's executions were important to her, as she wanted to bring her country back into Catholicism, but instead she left a legacy as a feared and heartless monarch, aka Bloody Mary. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.